So welcome to our session today. We're really glad you joined us. I'm Dr. Alicia Shadman from the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at NIU. I want to thank you for coming. We try to do these monthly on Tuesdays at noon. We've been doing them for a few months now during the pandemic. We hope to be able to continue those. And our goal is here to bring together an academic and a practitioner and kind of talk about a topic that we normally might not be able to talk about on a regular basis, but kind of get their opinions and thoughts on different large issues. So the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary here at NIU. We have an undergraduate program in nonprofit and NGO studies, and we do research about why we need each other, support each other, do this work of civic engagement. So our degree is both the larger humanities issues about why we need civil society, but also practical knowledge and skills like fundraising. So the topic for today that kind of came up and we wanted to chit chat about is civic engagement and advocacy. Who gets left out, who participates, the role of nonprofits in that work, education versus more words like lobbying and activism, social action, who gets to participate in the research needed for advocacy, etc. So I'm joined today by our two panelists, Dr. Julie Langer, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration here at NIU. She received her PhD and MPA from the University of Illinois, Chicago. She also worked in the nonprofit sector, leading collective impact initiatives to address the skills gap in Chicago's health services sector. And our other panelist for today is Alexandra Sossa, Executive Director of the Farmworker Landscaper Advocacy Project. She earned her law degree from the University of Medellin School of Law in Colombia, and she has more than 30 years of experience performing community outreach and education for low-income Latino immigrants and a long history of fighting for workers' rights, beginning with coffee plantation workers in her native Colombia. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
We often do a pre-session to get to know each other a little bit, and our conversation went really well. So I'm sure it'll go really well today as we kind of kick off our discussion. So kind of the format for today is we'll kick off some broad questions. I'll ask each of them to comment on, and then we'll see kind of where the conversation goes. So our big theme kind of that we're going to kick off our discussion with is advocacy, definitions, and legal regulations that sometimes nonprofits struggle with. So Alexandra, advocacy is in your organization's name. How does your organization define advocacy, and has that changed over time? And what kinds of advocacy does your organization do?
Yeah, well, thank you so very much for having me today, and also to everybody who is here to learn about non-for-profit and FLAP. Yes, the advocacy is part of our mission, and we accomplish that mission. We actually educate the workers about their legal rights, but we take the defendants, the employers who are abused, we take them to court, and we try to make a difference in the community, not only suing those companies and business that are abusing the workers on the name of one worker, but also on the name of a group of workers. So we are very well known in the community for doing class actions. And class actions is when one person sues a company, and then this person is suing on behalf of all his co-workers or her co-workers. So at the end of the day, in that case, you may have 1,500 people who are joining the case.
How long has your organization existed? How long have you been doing this work, Alexandra, in Northern Illinois anyway?
Yes, the organization was incorporated 22 years ago, more than in February 8, 1999. So we have been around for 22 years.
Wow. So Julie, in terms of what do we know about the rules and regulations of advocacy? What can nonprofits really do when it comes to advocacy? What's allowed, I guess? And what are ways that nonprofits typically do advocacy? What do we see in the research or your own experience?
Yeah, so really all nonprofits can participate in what we call advocacy, right? Whether it's pleading for or against a cause, supporting a position or a point of view or a course of action. This is something that any nonprofit can do regardless of whether or not they're a C3, a C4, a C5, a C6. Often C3s think that they're prohibited from participating in some of this type of activities because there are some stipulations regarding partisan activity, right? So C3s are not legally permitted to participate in partisan political activities, but outside of that, they can participate in most ways. So we can lump them under, and Alexandra already talked about a few of these. So we can talk about them under umbrella terms of representation. So this really means just acting on behalf of your constituents, whether or not you're testifying before legislative bodies or advocating for or against legislation. You might be participating in government planning and advisory groups or trying to influence the budget process. These are simple ways to represent or act on behalf of your clients. You can encourage others to act through mobilization, whether they're contacting elected officials. You know, we've all filled out forms that have been circulated by nonprofits to support different petitions. We might encourage our clients to participate in local demonstrations, or rallies, or boycotts. And importantly, as nonprofits, we can also register members to vote. We can encourage them to vote, and we can help them make a voting plan or get them to the polls, which is the area that I typically work in my research. So we can also just educate, right? So whether we're educating our own clients about their rights and responsibilities in the democratic process, whether we're disseminating facts about our nonprofit's cause in order to change attitudes or behavior. There's just a plethora of different ways nonprofits can work in this space.
No, I think that gives us a good sense. Julie, you mentioned, you know, one thing that maybe nonprofits are more nervous about doing some of this work. Are there like common myths like that where nonprofits are like, oh, we're not allowed to do that, or I didn't think we were allowed to do that? Are there other common myths that you think nonprofits have a perception they should not participate in?
Yeah, so I think that nonprofits tend to think that they can't participate in lobbying activities. And that is because there are these stipulations that nonprofits, particularly C3s, should not participate in a substantial amount of those activities. And essentially what that means is it shouldn't be the core thing that your organization is doing, but doing important work that supports your core mission around lobbying and advocacy, nonprofits can. So it's sort of a myth that you can't participate in this way or that it's illegal for your organization. It's not, and it's actually encouraged because nonprofits have this vital role of connecting underrepresented groups to our political system and to the market in ways that they would otherwise be left out.
And kind of along that line, and I did forget to mention, if anyone has questions, you can put those in the chat and I'll make sure that we get to those, or we'll cover them at the end in kind of a Q&A. Along those lines of like political rules and regulations, why do you think, Julie, in some of the work, and then I'll ask Alexandra the same kind of thing, why do you think they're challenged to do this advocacy work? So part of it is just not understanding what they can do under the rules and regulations. But besides that, what are kind of the challenges in doing that? And is there any differences between participating at different levels of government in your background experience or research?
Yeah, so in some of the research, what we see is the need for nonprofits, importantly, to navigate funding relationships. So they might want to avoid sounding too political, even if they're not acting in a partisan fashion. They might not want to put donors off. They might fear some unfavorable consequences related to political support or funding levels if they are engaged in this type of work. But really, nonprofits are needed in this work, especially at the local level. So if you take local elections alone, when nonprofits have voting related contacts with their constituents, so that means helping them to register, reminding them to vote, helping them make a voting plan, or helping them get to the polls, they're 11 percentage points more likely to vote when controlling for other factors that we know are important to increase voter turnout, things like age, education, income. So nonprofits play this really crucial role, particularly at the local level, where sometimes we see participation ranging only from 3 to 30%, and I would say 30% is super high in local elections. And often, you know, these are where some of the most important decisions are getting made about how to spend local dollars or shape local policy priorities. So especially at the local level, nonprofits are often key to engaging underrepresented populations in the political process and helping to shape or sort of balance out the more powerful interests that often dominate at the local level.
So to tease out a little bit of the rules around partisanship, And as I understand it, and Julie, you can comment on this, but as I understand it, if you stick to an issue rather than vote for Ted, you're in the clear. If you have, and I think many nonprofits actually do candidate nights, issues nights, forums, where both parties are represented. Again, that is allowed, and it's allowed that you say, we're against this particular bill that's being proposed. It doesn't matter who's doing it, but we're against that particular bill. Here's why, here's how that's affected. Is that my correct understanding? Is anything you wanted to add to that in terms of the partisanship? How do we make sure we stay out of the partisan side of that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when we say partisan, right, you don't want to come out and say, I'm the Red Cross and I'm for Donald Trump, or I'm for Joe Biden, go out and vote for him, right? But we can't talk about policies, immigration rights, things that impact our constituents, particular pieces of legislation. All of that, right? We talked about whether or not we're just educating around an issue or mobilizing. All of that is more than encouraged from the nonprofit sector. It really is only related to partisanship that we want to steer clear when we're engaging in these types of activities.
Right. We don't want it to be, our organization stands behind this individual and therefore you need to vote for him. So that's the hard line, right?
That's the hard line. That's the hard line. Yep.
Yeah. Or the appearance of, and I guess there's rules and regulations, or the appearance of, that you also are kind of walking that fine line. Yeah. Right.
And I think that fine line is what scares a lot of nonprofits off from engaging in this type of work. But there are even legal files, or the H election that you can file if you are engaging in a lot of this work as a C3 and you're concerned about it. You can go a different route to just report that you are, engaging in some of this type of activity, as long as it's just not partisan, as long as you're not saying, we are Republicans or we are Democrats and we support Joe Biden or, Ted or Jane or whoever it is. Yes, you can participate. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. So Alexandra, how challenging is it to do the advocacy that you do in this very highly politicized environment? You've been around, your organization has been around a while, but I'm sure that's changed over the shorter term. And thinking about big issues, whether that's human labor trafficking or immigration, what about those challenges in this politicized world? And I know we talked about, when we met earlier, about some examples that you have. Anything you want to share about that?
Yeah, sure. So the organization has been around for 22 years, and I joined the organization 19 years ago. So I have seen many changes in the organization. And the reason because the organization was incorporated is because those organizations who are non-for-profit receiving federal funding, they are not allowed to represent undocumented workers. So that's why FLAP was created, with the idea to do advocacy for those who are undocumented. And then we turned down federal funding. So our funding is coming from community foundations, private foundations, attorney's fees, referral fees, and fundraising, and all of individual donations. So we don't receive federal funding. And the idea of not receiving that federal funding is because if we receive federal funding, we cannot do class actions. We cannot represent undocumented workers. We cannot sue dairy farms. It's under the law that we are not allowed to do those things. So doing the advocacy work of FLAP is really challenging, because you are trying to educate a community who is undocumented, who is afraid to fight for their rights, who is afraid to do something, and they think they are going to be deported. They think they are going to be put in a blacklist. They think they don't want to have a profile that is very, like, they don't want to raise their profile. They want to be invisible. So it's very challenging. And also how other people see FLAP is also challenging. When you approach a foundation, when you approach a family foundation, a private donor, the first question is, does undocumented workers, do they have rights? And then we need to start getting into, yes, they can be a human labor person, they can be sexually harassed, they can't be not paid for overtime and minimum wage because they are undocumented. I mean, one thing is your immigration status and a different thing is your employment status. So those are the big challenges that we have.
So when you were thinking about some of the donations and you talked about the federal government, other kind of funding sources where it's been, and you mentioned a couple, come into question of which side of the political side are you on? How do you navigate that neutrality sometimes with your funders, because you rely a lot on private funding and you might have funding from different camps politically. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, we have to be very smart here and very creative. Let me just tell you a couple of examples. We went to a meeting with a foundation, and I am in that meeting with the foundation, and I wasn't smart enough to bring one of my board members with me who is maybe white person and doesn't have an accent. So I go there, and the first question that the grants committee is asking me is like, why do you think, Alexandra, we will be interested in supporting an organization that supports undocumented workers when we need to focus in those who are documented, legal permanent residents and citizens? And like, well, with this political environment, and then they were like, hold on, what political environment are you talking about it? And at that time, we had a Mr. Donald Trump was a president, and then I was like, well, I think the political environment is not really in our favor, like immigrants like us, and you have to try to do some makeup to your statements, but at the same time, I have to be loyal to the organization mission, and if they don't want to support our work, I need to pass, right? But be very diplomatic is very important in this type of work, believe me, because you can get in trouble really easy.
You mentioned boards, the importance of board members, bringing somebody with you. Why do you think, and not just so that they represent, the funder either ethnically or other demographic characteristics, why do you think your boards are so important to some of the work that you do, Alexandra? And then I'll ask Julie what you think of that.
Yeah, you know that part of the work of the board is to engage in fundraising, and I see Dina here, and we were part of a panel a while ago with our Vice President Jack King, and part of the work, and Dina and I talk about it in that panel. Part of the board work is to find foundations and to engage in fundraising, to find resources for the organization. So when you bring a board member to those meetings, it shows to the foundation how engaged your board is in fundraising. Most of the foundations applications, they will have a question that says, how committed is your board to fundraising? What % of your board is making a financial contribution to your organization? So when you bring a board member, of course, the board member also can help you with your statements and can save you. You're getting in trouble because they are not as afraid to say things as we are as executive directors of the organization. So I don't know, Julie, what you think, but I love to bring board members with me most of the time.
Yeah, Julie, what's your thoughts on board engagement in this advocacy work?
I think that board I think like Alexandra said, board engagement is really critical here. Of course, building a board that has the ability to garner resources for the organization, financial or otherwise, is sort of a base requirement these days in being able to build capacity within your organization to do this work. Often organizations are already strapped with the day-to-day requirements and activities of the organization. So things like advocacy and lobbying, if they're not central to the organization's mission, can be tossed on the back burner. So having board members engaged in this type of work definitely shows to funders that you have sort of a serious engagement from your board members. And it also, of course, will help to strengthen your ability as an organization to do this work continually and not just in a more sporadic fashion.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So we're 1 year in. I don't know if everybody recognized the COVID pandemic 1 year anniversary in many sense, but so during the pandemic, yeah, didn't even notice it, right? Didn't even notice it. So during the pandemic, we've had a major federal election, significant state elections. Now we're in local election season. For Julie, what do you think has changed as a result of the pandemic, positively or negatively, when it comes to this work of advocacy and civic engagement?
So, of course, the research is just coming out with regards to the impact of COVID on the nonprofit sector and on our communities as a whole. I know at the 1 year mark, it might be more fatigued now than at any other point. So I can imagine that nonprofits and their busy work in the communities are feeling the same. But we know that, nonprofits are really critical to increasing social trust in communities, and communities with higher levels of social trust tend to see both safer behaviors and have better health outcomes. So on the whole, the collective trauma that has been experienced by everyone from COVID has shown positive signs of civic engagement in terms of we're seeing higher voter turnout rates, we're seeing often these increases, at least in sporadic donations to nonprofits around particular causes. We see increased outreach to government leaders on behalf of nonprofit constituents, and some increased reports of volunteering requests, people wanting to volunteer for a cause or work with an organization. But as we all know, nonprofits are more strapped in terms of funding and demand for their services than maybe they've ever been. And if they're even able to weather the pandemic, like most, it's probably by focusing on programs and services that are essential and core to the organization. And like I said, advocacy and civic engagement often gets put to the back burner, especially because engagement looks a lot different now for organizations in this socially distanced world. So we're trying to figure out new ways to engage our communities to replace these sort of face-to-face interactions that we've had for so long. And we're just starting to realize ways to do this. The Urban Institute, if someone's looking, has a great new-ish handbook that they put out during COVID that looks at community engagement during COVID-19 and ways to navigate that. So that might be one resource for on the ground work if folks are still looking to figure out ways to navigate the COVID-19 climate in terms of advocacy, civic engagement, community engagement, etc.
Do you want to take a minute and kind of talk about the research that you've been doing during the pandemic because of the election work that you're doing and how that's been challenging to do the research to get organizations to participate because of those limitations that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing research regarding helping nonprofits build capacity to mobilize their constituents to get to the polls. So we were providing some mini civic engagement grants to nonprofits and then working with them to register their participants to vote, sending messaging reminders via postcard and text, as well as different messages in order to see what's most effective at getting folks out. Now in the national election, everywhere you turned, there was a voting reminder, right? You clicked on Facebook, voting reminder. You turned your head on the street, voting signs, billboards everywhere. So we had a lot of folks wanting to participate in the national election around this work with help. At the local level, we actually had to change the field experiment because nonprofits just don't have the capacity or the desire to get out and try to do this work on top of everything else that they are doing. So it's been really a challenge for all of us to go beyond the core and essential activities of our personal lives, organizations, institutions, etc.
And do you think, and this is just a hunch because you're still analyzing your data, collecting your data, do you think that it's one, a capacity issue? Is it also related to the perception that local elections don't matter as much to nonprofit organizations? I don't know if that's true, but it seems to be that's a plausible theory.
Yeah, that would tie in with general theory that most individuals, don't know that local elections are going on ever. They're not exactly sure what individuals at the local level do. Like, what does your clerk do? What does the village manager do? How is that different than a mayor? Right? There's just a lot of these knowledge barriers around local elections. But in fact, we know that local elections are often the most important determinants of the policy environment that nonprofits are working in at a local level. So how funding is getting distributed, whether it's getting distributed, and in what amounts to our police departments versus our social service agencies, as national debates have been talking about. This is happening at the local level, right? That these decisions are getting made. So turning out the vote in these types of elections and getting your local municipality to have more than 3% of individuals voting, and typically those 3% of individuals representing the most powerful and already represented interests in your community, is super important. And the work that nonprofits can do at this level as trusted mediaries between their clients and the political system is just super duper important.
Yeah, I think sometimes how funding flows to nonprofits might start out at the federal level, but there's a lot of gates before it gets down, and those decisions are made along the way at the state and then at the local level. We saw that in Illinois during the budget impasse. Yeah, there was maybe no state funding, but it wasn't just that. It was your federal dollars were locked because they couldn't pass through the state to get to, even if it wasn't state dollars that were coming down. So lots of interesting decisions along the way, but sometimes I think we forget how many decisions are actually very local in many cases. Yeah. So Alexandra, thinking about COVID-19, as your organization has been around for a long time before COVID, how has it changed your organization, either your focus or how you do your work? That's the first part. And then we'll get into that discussion of when you think about the essential workers that you represent, how is that coming into play in the work that you do, but also for the general public to have a better sense of who they are?
COVID-19? What is that, Alicia? I'm not familiar with COVID-19. Well, COVID-19 was, my God, a year ago, we were completely panicked. Like, oh my God, this organization is going to be dissolved. Because our main theme before COVID-19 was to do Know Your Rights presentations. Our Know Your Rights presentations will focus in teaching the workers about their rights at work, right? So with the keeping the social distance and not allowed to be to the fields and go to the farms and teach the workers about their rights and not having any contact with the workers, not allowed to go to the Mexican consulate when we saw 600 workers per day, then we are done. Let's close the organization and let's be happy. I'll move back to Colombia and be in the beach. Okay, great. That was what we were thinking a year ago, like today was a year ago, my mother's birthday, by the way. 2 weeks later, I got together with my board and we said, okay, we need to amend our mission. And we started identifying the needs in the community. And then we start getting, instead of getting 12 phone calls per day, we start getting 100 phone calls per day. The phone calls of the workers they were calling, telling us like, I don't have a job, I have a family, I don't have money to sustain my family. What am I going to do? What are my legal options? And then we start getting phone calls like, I have COVID. My family member died because of COVID. 3 family members just died. 2 tested positive. Like, we don't know what to do. And then we start, so we have to amend the bylaws of the organization. And we went from improving the workers' conditions, doing outreach, community education, litigation, to provide financial assistance to the workers, and also addressing family separations, encouraging the workers to get the dual citizenship. For the kids who were born in the United States, then they will have the American citizenship and the Mexican citizenship. Then if the parents are going to be deported, they can take the kids with them. And then we will address in family separations. So in amending the bylaws, we distribute last year $1.5 million in cash assistance to the workers, like pay rent, pay utilities, give me the name of the mortgage. We will write a check for $5,000 to the mortgage company. Here is $500 that you can use whatever you need. Here is a grocery store card that you can use to buy food. Here is a food bank where you can go. Here is, give me your utilities bill, I'll pay for that. So it was just like incredible how we struggle with this COVID-19, but at the same time, it was also incredible to see 88 foundations coming along to support FLAP and calling me and telling me, like, Alexandra, what do you need? How we can help? We are here to support you. So I was sharing with you, Alicia, and with you, Julie, that we went from having those foundations who will tell me, like, who cares about undocumented workers? Who cares about them? Now they're calling me and say, they are essential workers. We need them. How we can help you? So I was completely burned out with the amount of phone calls I receive in a day and the Zoom meetings I have to attend. Like, I attend almost 2,000 Zoom meetings last year. So it was insane. If I'm telling you that I was in 6 Zoom meetings per day, I'm not lying, but it's how we were able to sustain the organization and help our community and show to the community that the essential workers, farm workers, landscapers, meat and cutting factory workers are important and they are behind the food that we have on our tables. So that's my version of COVID-19. God.
How do you think, so in the short term, it sounds like funders pretty quickly figured out they needed to support your work and support the workers because it was impacting everybody when the shelves are empty, when all of a sudden you couldn't get this item, but you could get that item. That's all based on who are working in the farms or in the plants. What do you think is going to stick? So do you think this has changed either public perception or the funders' perception of the work that you do longer term beyond this kind of crisis?
I do think that's happening, and I can see it.
Okay.
We all were thinking that on December 31st, when we wake up on January 1st, COVID was gone. Oh, it's a new year, it's happy. It's not the case. COVID is here, COVID is still around. We are dealing with that. And then the workers are struggling. It's still, it will take, I think, years to recover for this economy disaster that is happening. People behind on rent, people behind on mortgage, people not having resources to sustain their family. We see kids, migrant kids, who they do not have laptops to do their homework, and they are behind on school because of the electronic learning. They are not allowed to go to school, then they can do the homework. So I think the foundations are realizing that. I think the foundation, the family foundations, individual donors, and many people who didn't know, who didn't think about essential workers are now thinking about Latins, essential workers, and why it's important to support organizations like FLAP. It's very sad, it's extremely sad to know that it took a pandemic for people to realize how important are essential workers, for people to realize we do have farm workers in Illinois. I have people asking me in Zoom meetings and asking me in grantees meetings with foundations, like, farm workers? No, Alexandra, you don't meet our guidelines because we don't have farm workers in Illinois. And I was just like, would you like to go with me to a field trip? Then I'll show you where they are in DeKalb County, McHenry County, Lake County, and all over Northern Illinois and Central Illinois. So I think my answer is yes. Yes, Alicia.
So you're optimistic that we've turned a corner on some of this. And I guess money will tell where those resources go, because I'm sure your organization and other organizations benefited a lot from the quick release of those rapid response grants and COVID relief funding. Those will start to draw down. Some organizations, some foundations, they're now starting to, kind of sunset some of those resources. So I guess time will tell if the emphasis will still be on that work or not. We'll have to see. Maybe we'll have a follow-up next year and kind of see where you're at.
Yes, let's make an appointment for 1 year.
1 year, we'll make an appointment. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yes.
I love it. Something that you guys kind of both mentioned when we're thinking about this work in particular, this advocacy and civic engagement work, and maybe Julie, I'll ask you first. Thinking about what do you think organizations can do coming out of this pandemic that might change some of their advocacy work going forward? So kind of what does that future look like for these organizations? What have we learned in COVID, either how they do their work or what their focus is on when it comes to advocacy? I don't want to make it too big. That will keep maybe, or that will tweak, because I think running these elections during a pandemic has taught us many things. There's also been some hard lessons. Oh, by the way, we also did a census in there too, which was a whole other get out the census and who gets counted. But what do you think are some lessons that we can learn or nonprofits can learn going through this?
Great question. And I think that there's a lot, of course, that we can all take away from the pandemic. I think that with regards to advocacy, what nonprofits might be able to take with them from the pandemic is how central getting the message about what your organization does and advocating on behalf of your mission, how important that is to supporting the foundations of society, not to make it too esoteric or too big, but these types of actions have big ripples, even though on the day-to-day it might feel smaller. This is foundation changing work of the types of societies we want to build in the future. So being able to keep advocacy central to your organization and knowing that yes, foundations do care about this work, right? And funders do care about this work. They just need to know and be persuaded that they care about this work, right? And whether COVID-19 highlighted that or whether it keeps going or not, we can all hope that the pandemic has helped us to see that the way that we're structuring society and that the values that we place on organizations outside of the nonprofit sector are out of balance, and we need this type of work to continue in a more sustained and less sporadic fashion. I also think we've learned about different ways to engage individuals, right? Whether, the use of technology can help us, but it's definitely not everything. I think everyone can, admit that the loss of face-to-face contact, at least in the classroom or in the type of work you do, is a huge loss. That being said, there is also some learning lessons about how flexible our organizations are and how quickly we can pivot if we need to get our message out or to use technology and other types of resources we have to engage individuals in this process moving forward. So I would say sustained, not sporadic, and the importance and balance of both face-to-face and online technology in these types of efforts moving forward.
Now, Alexandra, you mentioned too that you did take a look at your mission, your bylaws, some of your programs to figure out what kind of organization you were going to be during the pandemic and kind of what you're going to look like going forward. For your organization, what does that look like? Do you think that you've kind of struck a chord, that it's not a very narrow interest, it's actually a pretty broad interest, and the pandemic kind of highlighted it for that? How do you see that evolving going forward?
Yeah, no, definitely. We amended our bylaws and our mission, and it's now permanent, like giving financial assistance to the workers is now a permanent part of our mission. It's not just only during the pandemic. And also encouraging parents to get the dual citizenship for the kids who were born in the United States to get the Mexican citizenship. So those two things are now a permanent part of the organization. I want to expand a little bit with what Julie just mentioned. And I think the foundations are very interested in the work that we do and the work of non-for-profit organizations. I think they don't give funding is because they don't know or they are not aware of the work. Let me tell you that our success is from 10 organizations we approach, only one will reject us. So our success is 90%. So the hardest part is to get a meeting with them, is to call their attention to agree to speak with us. But once they talk to us, voila, it's funding. They will give us funding because they are interested in the work that we are doing. There are some very, very few exceptions when they will tell us, like, we don't care about essential workers, to be honest with you. We are more worried about our corporations and our business. But those are very, very, very few. So at the long term, I think there is a lot of potential for this organization, for FLAP. And we are now a $1.9 million organization. I think this organization has the capacity to be a $5 million and then be helping the farm workers and the landscapers and the factory workers and the snow removal workers, restaurant workers in any capacity we can, legal services, social services. We are right now focusing, for example, in providing laptops to the kids to do education and to do the homework, because we discovered during the pandemic that they were behind on school. And then I start calling and why you are not doing your homework? What's going on with you? Come on, it's COVID, but we need to do our homework. I do not have a laptop. I do not have a cellular phone. Oh my God. Okay, so we need to bring you the cellular phone and the laptop.
So responding to that immediate need, those kind of basic human needs that we all have, especially during the pandemic, and then thinking more long-term, right? How does FLAP, after growing so significantly and so quickly during the pandemic, how do you define success of this work? How does your board discuss that? We know when we're successful when. What does that look like, or what are the conversations like at FLAP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have this conversation at our strategic planning that actually we started strategic planning in February last year, and then the pandemic was coming, and then I was like, great, this is a great year for the strategic planning. So let's finish with the strategic planning. And we had this conversation in January this year, and we evaluated the project. So we evaluate FLAP for how many people we are helping, how much money we are distributing, how many laptops we bring to the kids, how many phone calls we get, how many people from that phone call we do follow-ups, how much staff we have, how many partner organizations are now part of the organization that we went for partnering with 60 organizations last year before the pandemic to partnering now with 150 organizations, because we realized that partnership and networking was so important before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. We needed to bring money to workers in DeKalb County or in Central Illinois. So the way to do it was to partner with an organization based in that county to be able to reach out to more workers. So it's how the board is doing evaluation for the project, and it's how we see that we are really making a difference in the community. Numbers are important, and I hate to say this to my staff, but it doesn't matter you get 100 phone calls per day if you are not documented that work and you are not able to show that to foundations and donors and to the impact we are doing. It's kind of like your work is going to the garbage, because who knows that you are receiving 100 phone calls? I know that, but the community doesn't know that. The foundations don't know that. So it's important. It's important to document data, statistics, put it in writing, share in Facebook, share in social media, put it in your website, let everybody know what are you doing, how are you doing, those things.
And Julie, when you think about successful advocacy for nonprofits, are there suggestions you can think of ways that they can measure their impact when it comes to that work?
Yes. I think measurement is important, as Alexandra pointed out. I think that in the way that we have structured how all of this works right now, you have to show the numbers. But I also think that we should continue to recognize the eye of the heart, the real life-changing work that we're doing. So I am just amazed by the things that Alexandra is talking about, and the human response to all of the problems that we're facing and how interconnected we are, right? So I think it's amazing that they got, 5,000 kids laptops. That's life-changing. But the core of that is just so much bigger than those numbers. So measure those numbers, but I would also say, if the numbers only catch the eye of 2 out of 10 foundations, like, don't despair, and know, like, internally that this work is life-changing, it's world-changing. And that to me is a measure of success. So
Yeah, I'm so impressed by the nonprofit work, even, before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic, that those basic human needs, we got there pretty quick, right? We got there pretty quick with this pandemic, whether it was healthcare, whether it was food, those basic needs. I mean, all that other stuff is great, but if we can't take care of each other's basic needs in a country that is so incredibly wealthy and resource rich, we have bigger problems. So I think the work that Alexandra's doing and other nonprofits, it really highlighted that that dependency on each other, mutual dependency that we are on each other. Yeah. So kind of closing thoughts. We talked about this when we chatted earlier. Alexandra, can you think of some closing thoughts that you have, kind of hopeful? And I know you're already a very hopeful person, but how do you think we should think about kind of coming out of this? What are some kind of lasting things you hope that we keep as a result of the experiences going through this last year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I do this type of presentations, my goal is to create some awareness in the community about essential workers. So I'm sure that everybody who is here today, when you finish this presentation, you are start paying attention to those who are doing snow removal that you never noticed before, to those who are doing landscaping work. Maybe when you are having lunch today or dinner, you may take a moment to think about the farm workers and how that food got into your table. There are human beings behind all this work. Things doesn't happen magically. And in this country, many of the migrant workers who are undocumented and who are Latins are the ones who are doing those jobs and that work that is not qualified. And we don't take a moment to think about the needs of those workers. We are talking about a farm worker makes $14,000 per year. I don't even know how they sustain their families. I don't even know how they can have a life. It's how it is. So I just want to call the attention on that issue, and maybe you will think how you can contribute to make this a better country for immigrant workers.
And Julie, your hopeful thoughts as we're coming out of this?
I think that my hopeful thoughts, or what I would say in terms of nonprofit advocacy, is the same thing that I tell students who come into class and, they want to create like the biggest, most grand collective impact initiative between businesses and for-profits and government. And it's great and it's inspiring, but I want them to not forget that every little action counts. So if your organization doesn't have the capacity to have a major lobbying arm or advocacy initiative, you can sustain small actions that will be just as impactful. So I think that would be sort of my hope for the future, is that everyone can do this work in some capacity. And the more we all do it in some capacity, the stronger the whole is. So that would be my takeaway for the future.
And I think as we were chatting, one of the things that we're thinking about here at the center, among other things, is this idea of wages and living wages. And, for nonprofits to think about their own employees as much as they think about the people that they're serving. So Alexandra, I know we had that conversation of make sure that your own organization is living up to those same ideals that you're promoting in the community, is to think about your own workers. So we here at the center, we had this discussion about, where we won't share job postings unless there's a salary range, unless we know going out, because we know that generally people who have lower income means, they think the wage is going to pay this, and it's not clear what the wage is. So that's a small thing, but I think things like that, and whether that's medical benefits, whether that's, professional development or tuition assistance, whatever it is, think through how can you also offer your own staff those same things that you're advocating for in that broader community, and what are you doing kind of internally to do those things. So that's my kind of take on a little bit on that. So we're
Alicia,
go ahead,
one more thing.
Go ahead.
It's also important that we in our non-for-profits pay well to the workers, to the staff. Because I run into non-for-profits who advocate for others, but then you see the staff, and the staff is getting paid zero, nothing. And it's like, oh my God, how can you work there?
And it can't be the ED advocating for that. That's another board issue as well in this work, because the ED and staff, they're advocating for their own salaries. It really does have to come. It has to be a board discussion and a board decision to move in that direction. Because sometimes the boards are like, well, we need to pay you more, but then you just have to raise that money yourself. So probably it's going to be too challenging, or we don't really, that's not where we're going to grow our resources. And you're like, really? So I think it's definitely good board discussion. So if there's any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. We can, and there's not that many of us. There's about 20 folks on the line. I'm happy if you do want to chat. To ask your question verbally to our panelists, we would welcome that while we still have a few minutes left of our noon hour. For those of you who are eating lunch or going about your day. Any kind of questions that you want to ask our panelists? And I think I have to, well, maybe I don't have to. I can unmute you, but if you let me know if you want to chat, I can unmute you.
Yeah, and Alicia, I'm so pleased to see so many familiar faces here and to see the interest of people learning about non-for-profits, and it's so great. Yeah.
Maybe you have a following, Alexandra. Maybe it's you.
Well, maybe it's Julie, or maybe
it's
the
Julie,
two of us. I don't know.
Who knows? Who knows? I'm happy that everybody's here who's here. So Darian had asked the question, making the organization a professional destination, and Diana commented, explain more what a professional destination is. So I don't know, Darian, if you want to ask that or kind of comment on that verbally. I'm gonna ask you to unmute if you would like.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much. Yep, absolutely. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we are representing the Northern Illinois.
Very nice.
I feel like it's alienated. But what I was mentioning is that, while we are mentoring young people to get to and through college and onto a successful career, it's that successful career part that we really need to focus on. Yeah, especially in the African-American community, get your education. But if we are not providing those network and resources to ensure that these graduates who have put in the work and have gotten the degrees can plug into their particular field that they want to work in and get their work experience, whether it's through internship or any opportunity to actually work. Fast forward, so now these young people have graduated, they are in their careers. Why not allow one of these great nonprofits to be a a professional destination to say, hey, you know what? I've gotten my education. I can apply everything that I've learned. I want to come back and work for that particular nonprofit. Yeah. And grow it to the standpoint of, hey, you know what? Why can't we structure it to where everyone's on the staff is on the payroll, everyone can get benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the type of concept that I was thinking about. Yeah. And what it does is just continues to repeat the cycle and have a pipeline of educated professionals that want to do community work and help grow the community at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Darian, for that reminder. And that is something that we're trying to promote with our students, is that as much as possible to be allowed to pay them, because we know that people cannot participate to the same degree in unpaid opportunities like unpaid internships or things like that. So as much as possible, we definitely support funding our students because we think it's so important for them financially, but also to get that experience. So we're not setting them up for inequity when they graduate. which is, I think, the challenge. I wasn't able to do an internship or a study abroad or all those things that people talked about when I was an undergrad for some of those reasons. And I think many of our students are in the same boat. So I appreciate the comment. Thank you.
Alicia, if I may something,
Yeah.
so thank you for the comment. Let me tell you that FLAP is very well known because we don't take interns here who are not getting paid. So they apply and they
Yeah,
say
that's
like,
great.
oh, I just want to be a volunteer. And like, no. Let's find funding. And I have like and I'm happy to share this with you guys if you want to, but I have a 20 pages document with foundations and law firms and private donors who will sponsor our interns and who will pay us or will pay to the intern to do the work for FLAP. So
That's amazing.
no free work here. Come on, we are a employment organization, know that first. And second, the first thing I tell our attorneys and our operations manager and our staff is like, every single meeting we can take our intern with us is going with us. Like I take my interns to meetings that are just for executive directors and they're kind of like, well, okay, and she is my intern and she's learning how to become executive director. That's why it's in this meeting. So I do that because only when you guys get, like when the interns are putting their hands in the work is how they will learn about things. We have Solomon conference, we have like depositions where our interns are sitting and are watching. And why an intern is here, like, sorry, if you don't like it, maybe we shouldn't be in this Solomon conference with you, is what we tell to defendants. Because this intern is our next staff attorney for the organization. It's our next co-consul. So yes, thank you for that point. I completely agree with you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Let's see. So Daniel, you had a question. If you, I can ask you to unmute. I'll read it if you want, but you can also ask it yourself if you'd like to.
Yeah, I was just wondering if nonprofits felt a need to engage people on their email lists that are maybe no longer opening emails or no longer giving at the same rate they were before. In what ways you've found to encounter that? Because I have a couple ideas that I've been working with some clients, but I'd be interested to hear what you all have to say.
Because we're getting thousands and thousands of emails every day, right? Yeah, I don't know, Julie, if you have any thoughts on that. When it comes to the work that you were trying to do, email was probably a strategy. Do you think that was the most successful strategy, or are there other strategies that your work highlighted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on what kind of what kind of supporter they were, how long they had supported your organization, and at what level. So we typically talk about, as you probably know, donor stewardship or supporter stewardship, right? So some folks need to be engaged with personally, depending on their contribution to the organization. In some instances, we can reach out to folks, with emails. Particularly, we engaged with both text messages and postcards to nonprofits. Actually, we found text messages to annoy people or to respond in because around the national election, people were getting so many. So I think it's important to think about what type of modality you're using at what particular time and who the client or the potential donor is. Did you have like a specific?
Go ahead, Daniel, you're still on mute. Oh, I have to unmute you. How about that? Try it now.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there's some technologies I've been working with advocacy groups, both local and national in nature, that would allow you to give specific digital advertising across the web, but only to your email list. So you're not paying for reaching digital ads across the web for anybody. It's the exact people that were past donors. And I'm just curious if anyone has tried that before and what success you may or may not have had.
So Alexandra, I don't know if you want to comment on how do you use your donors and supporters in some of the work that you do, and has email really shifted at all?
Yeah, I agree with what Julie just said. And honestly, Daniel, it depends of the donor. It depends of the organization. It's like you have to be smart enough to figure out what the other person wants to. I have people telling me like, please don't call me, I'm very busy, send me an email. And then I send an email and I get a $20,000 donation the next day. I have people that I send an email and why you email me? Why instead of email me, why you don't call? And then I call and they, yes, I will give you a $5,000 donation. So it's really like, you know, it's like testing the other person to see what the preferences are. At the very beginning, when I get in touch with a potential donor, with an organization, with a potential partner, I always ask, what's your preference way of communication? So no matter what, we send newsletters using emails 4 times a year. I don't think it's not too much. I think it's great. And we don't want abuse of that, because when you get those emails like every week, every 2 weeks, you just delete it. But if you only are getting 4 per year, you are more likely to get people to open those newsletters. And then we got phone calls, very few, honestly, only for those who are very, very old school. I personally don't take well the phone calls because I'm very busy. So if you send me, if you are trying to call me right now, I can't answer. But if I see an email from you, I probably will answer faster. So you have to be very, very creative and just get the taste of the other person, and try everything until something works. And don't be offended if people tell you too many texts, too many emails, too many phone calls, blah, blah, blah. Just try something different until you figure out what this person likes.
So Alexandra, it sounds like you and many executive directors, you're behavioral social scientists. You're using behavioral experimentation to do your work, which is just amazing. It's just really amazing. Well, I want to thank both of you. Unless Julie, you had one more thought, because I know it's 1 o'clock, but.
I was going to direct Daniel to some resources. There are some scholars, David Campbell and others, who have looked at social media use among public and non-for-profit human service organizations in terms of targeted marketing. So you can go to Google Scholar and just Google their names, or Google nonprofit social media marketing, if that's where you're thinking about using targeted ads, to get a little bit more of the up-to-date research on some of those strategies. And perhaps you know this, but from a previous life where I worked in marketing and communications, it does typically take like at least 5 to 10 times of someone seeing an ad before they'll take action on it. So that's something to consider as you're going down that path as well.
Thank you, Daniel, for the question. Thank you, Alexandra and Julie, for your participation. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I am, like I said, going to make this recording available